Hey guys, tonight Oh, you're already tucked in. Excellent. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time, peeling back the layers of the late 19th century like a perfectly ripe, slightly sleepy onion. Imagine yourself standing on a dusty, cobbled street in a bustling, complicated town called Białystok. The air is thick with the scent of markets, maybe a distant train whistle, and the low murmur of countless conversations. But here's the catch: those conversations? They're happening in Polish, Russian, German, Yiddish, Belarusian, sometimes all within earshot. You watch people interact, or fail to interact, their words hitting invisible walls, their meanings lost in translation, sometimes leading to sharp glances or hurried steps away. It's a world where the very sounds coming out of your mouth can mark you as other, a world where linguistic difference isn't just inconvenient, it's a source of real, tangible division and mistrust. You probably won't survive trying to navigate this linguistic minefield without a very patient local guide, or maybe a universal translator that, spoiler alert, hadn't been invented yet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always wild to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're there, on that street. Look around. The buildings might seem quaint to your modern eyes, but the tensions are anything but. This isn't some abstract historical concept. This is the lived reality of a young boy named Ludwig Zamenhof, growing up in this very town. Białystok, at this particular moment in history, was a borderland, a place where empires rubbed shoulders. The Russian Empire held sway, but Polish culture, German influence, and a large, vibrant Jewish community, Zamenhof's own, were all interwoven. It was, to put it mildly, a demographic and linguistic casserole, and not everyone was getting along at the dinner table. Think about it from a child's perspective. You see adults, people you look up to, treating each other with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility, simply because they speak different languages and, by extension, belong to different ethnic or national groups. It's like being on a playground where kids speaking English, Spanish, and Mandarin instantly form separate cliques and start throwing sand at each other, purely because they can't understand the other kids asking them to stop. For Zamenhof, this wasn't just background noise. It was the defining problem of his world. He saw language not just as a tool for communication, but as the primary barrier preventing humanity from realizing its shared potential for peace and understanding. Historians still argue whether Zamenhof's focus on language as the root cause of conflict was entirely accurate, or if it was more of a symptom of deeper political, economic, and social issues. I mean, people find reasons to fight even when they speak the same language, right? Just look at any family dinner. But from young Ludwig's viewpoint, witnessing daily friction exacerbated by incomprehension, the linguistic divide seemed like the most obvious, most fixable problem. If only everyone could talk to each other, truly understand each other, surely they would see their common humanity and stop fighting. It was a profoundly simple, almost childlike, yet incredibly powerful idea. This belief wasn't just a fleeting thought, it became an obsession, a quest that would shape his entire life. While other kids were dreaming of being soldiers or merchants, young Ludwig was dreaming of building bridges out of words. He imagined a language so simple, so logical, and so neutral that it could belong to everyone, a common ground where people could meet without the baggage of national identity or historical animosity embedded in their mother tongues. It was a radical dream, born from a deep well of empathy and a surprising, almost naive, optimism in the face of a world that seemed determined to prove him wrong. He wasn't the first person to dream of a universal language, not by a long shot. People had been tinkering with the idea for centuries, creating philosophical languages based on logic or attempting to revive Latin. But Zamenhof's approach was different. He wasn't trying to create a language for philosophers or scientists, or a secret code for the elite. He wanted a language for everyone, a practical tool for everyday communication across borders. A quirky tidbit: one earlier attempt at a universal language, called Salrasal, was based entirely on musical notes. Imagine trying to order a coffee by humming a tune. Zamenhof definitely went in a more practical direction, thankfully. So, picture him, a studious, perhaps slightly introverted boy, poring over grammar books, dissecting languages, trying to understand what makes them work, what makes them hard, and what makes them carry the weight of history and identity. He wasn't just learning languages. He was trying to learn the essence of language itself, searching for universal principles that could form the foundation of his own creation. It was a painstaking, solitary journey, fueled by that burning conviction that if he could just solve this linguistic puzzle, he could help solve the world's problems. He saw the Tower of Babel not as a punishment, but as a challenge to be overcome. He believed that the confusion of tongues was the primary obstacle to brotherhood, and that a single, shared language could unlock an era of unprecedented peace and cooperation. It's a level of optimism that, frankly, feels almost quaint from our vantage point in the 21st century, after, everything that's happened. But in that troubled, hopeful 19th century world, for a young man in a divided city, it felt like the most important work he could possibly undertake. This wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a moral imperative, a crusade for peace waged with grammar rules and vocabulary lists. And it all started right there, on those multi-tongued streets of Białystok, watching and listening to a world struggling to speak to itself. So, you're still there with young Ludwig, watching him pore over those heavy books, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across his determined face. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a mission. He carried the weight of Białystok's linguistic chaos and the world's potential for conflict on his young shoulders. His early attempts at tackling this monumental problem weren't born in a sterile lab, but in the quiet corners of his family home, perhaps late into the night when everyone else was asleep. You can picture him, a teenager now, maybe scratching away with a pen, filling notebooks with strange symbols and lists of words. He wasn't just learning languages. He was trying to reverse engineer them, to find the universal engine hidden beneath the messy surface of human communication. His first ideas were, understandably, a bit ambitious, maybe even a little naive, much like his core belief that language was the key to world peace. He considered reviving an ancient language like Latin or Greek, thinking perhaps a neutral, historical tongue could serve the purpose. But he quickly realized that these languages, while rich, were complex, full of irregular verbs and tricky grammar that had taken centuries to evolve. Plus, they weren't truly neutral. They carried the historical baggage of the cultures that had used them. Using Latin might feel less neutral to, say, a Russian speaker than to someone from Western Europe. His goal was a language that belonged to nobody culturally, so it could belong to everybody. Then, he tried tinkering with existing languages, attempting to simplify them. Imagine trying to take German, with its delightful cases and genders, why is a fork feminine, anyway, or English, with its utterly chaotic spelling and pronunciation, read, read, lead, make it stop, and strip away all the confusing bits. It sounds like a linguistic version of trying to untangle a giant ball of yarn while wearing oven mitts. He quickly discovered that simplifying a natural language often made it less expressive, or just created a new kind of complexity. It was like trying to build a simple car by removing parts from a complex one. You often just end up with something that doesn't run. This youthful quest wasn't just about academic puzzles, it was deeply personal. He was fueled by those memories of the street, the inability of people to connect, the simmering tensions. His language project was his response to the world he saw. It was a tangible expression of his deep-seated desire for harmony, a belief that if people could just talk to each other without misunderstanding, without the built-in biases of national languages, they would naturally gravitate towards peace. You can almost feel the intensity of that hope radiating from those early, probably messy, notebooks. He worked largely in secret during these formative years. He didn't want to announce his grand plan before he had something solid, something that actually worked. Perhaps he feared ridicule, or maybe he just wanted to perfect it before sharing his dream with the skeptical world. This secrecy adds a touch of mystery to his early process. Was he hiding his work under his bed? Did he have a secret code for his notes? We don't know the specifics, but the image of this young man quietly pursuing his world-changing goal in solitude is quite powerful. One quirky tidbit from this period, accounts suggest that in his earliest attempts, he tried creating a language where words were assigned based on categories, almost like a philosophical classification system, rather than borrowing from existing languages. Imagine words for colors, shapes, or actions being derived from some logical, abstract root system. It was a fascinating intellectual exercise, but ultimately impractical for natural communication. He realized that a language needed a certain degree of organic flow, a connection to existing linguistic concepts to be truly learnable and usable by ordinary people, not just logicians. This early experimentation, trying out different radical approaches, shows he wasn't afraid to fail and learn. Historians still argue whether how much of his later successful language, Esperanto, was already present in these initial youthful drafts. Some believe the core principles were there from the start, while others think he underwent a more significant shift in approach later on, particularly after encountering languages like English with their simpler grammar compared to Slavic or Germanic tongues. Was it an evolution or a revolution in his thinking? We may never know the exact path he took through those early notebooks, but we know the destination he aimed for, a language that was both simple and expressive, capable of carrying the full weight of human thought and emotion across borders. This period of youthful experimentation was crucial. It wasn't just about the mechanics of language, it was about solidifying his why. Every failed attempt, every linguistic dead end, reinforced his conviction that the problem was real and needed solving. It honed his understanding of what a universal language could and should be. He wasn't just building a language, he was building a tool for a better world, one word, one grammar rule at a time. It was an act of profound optimism, a belief that despite the evidence of history and the tensions he saw daily, humanity could overcome its divisions if given the right tools. He was crafting not just a language, but a blueprint for global understanding, driven by the simple, powerful hope of a young man who just wanted everyone to get along. And this painstaking, solitary work was just the beginning of that incredible journey. So, you've seen young Ludwig grappling with those early, perhaps slightly wild ideas. You've watched him try to revive old languages and wrestle with simplifying existing ones, realizing that neither path quite led to the universal, neutral tool he envisioned. Now, fast forward a few years. He's no longer a child with just a dream. He's a young man, perhaps studying medicine in Moscow or Warsaw, but the language quest is still his relentless companion. The notebooks are still there, but the scribbles are becoming more focused, the chaos giving way to a structured, deliberate process. This is where the painstaking work of crafting the universal tongue truly begins. Imagine him, maybe late at night after a long day of medical studies, because yes, he was also pursuing a practical career, perhaps to appease his parents, or maybe just to have something to fall back on if the whole world piece through language thing didn't pan out, a sensible backup plan, honestly. He's poring over dictionaries and grammar books from various languages, Latin, Greek, French, German, English, Polish, Russian, Hebrew. He wasn't just learning them, he was dissecting them like a linguistic surgeon. He was looking for the commonalities, the roots that appeared in multiple languages, the grammatical structures that were the simplest and most logical. His core realization was that a universal language shouldn't be based on a single existing language, nor should it be entirely artificial and abstract. It needed to be a synthesis, a carefully curated blend. He decided to borrow vocabulary from the most widely spoken European languages, primarily Romance and Germanic ones, because he believed this would give the language a familiar feel to a large number of potential speakers, making it easier to learn. But he wasn't just copying words, he was adapting them, simplifying their spelling and pronunciation to fit a strict, phonetic system. One letter, one sound. Say goodbye to the glorious chaos of English spelling where oof can sound like ah, fa, o, up, or oh. In Zamenhof's new language, once you learned the alphabet, you knew how to pronounce every single word. It's like a linguistic utopia where spelling bees are rendered utterly pointless. Then there was the grammar. Ah, grammar. The bane of many a language learner's existence. Zamenhof looked at the irregular verbs, the confusing noun genders, the cases that changed word endings based on their function in a sentence, like in German or Russian, and he said, "Nope. Not today." He designed a grammar system that was incredibly simple, regular, and logical. There were no irregular verbs, none. Every verb followed the same pattern. Nouns ended in O, adjectives in A, adverbs in E. Plurals were formed by adding J. Direct objects took a simple N ending. That was pretty much it for the core structure. It was like building with linguistic Lego blocks. Everything fit together perfectly, predictably. This wasn't just simpler. It was designed to eliminate ambiguity and make the language incredibly fast to learn compared to natural languages. You could grasp the fundamental grammar rules in an afternoon, rather than spending years wrestling with exceptions and nuances. But here was the brilliant balancing act: simplicity without sacrificing expressiveness. How do you do that? Zamenhof used a system called agglutination. Instead of having separate words for everything, you could build words by adding prefixes and suffixes to root words. Take the root word learn to learn. Add I for the infinitive, learny to learn. Add anto for a present active participle noun, learnanto, a learner. Add mal, prefix meaning opposite, and a, adjective ending malerna, unlearned, ignorant. Add re, prefix meaning again, and I relearny to relearn. It was like having a linguistic toolkit where you could construct precisely the word you needed, conveying nuanced meanings with just a few simple building blocks. This allowed the language to be incredibly flexible and capable of expressing complex ideas, poetry, and emotion, despite its simple structure. It wasn't just functional, it could be beautiful. This process wasn't quick or easy. He reportedly worked on it for years, refining, testing, discarding ideas that didn't fit the vision. He would translate pieces of literature, test the language's ability to convey different styles and moods, and constantly adjust. It was a solitary intellectual marathon. One quirky tidbit from this period is that he initially developed several versions of the language, sometimes referred to as primitive Esperanto, which were slightly different from the final version. He even reportedly had a group of friends in his youth who learned and tested one of these early versions, providing feedback. So, while much of the work was solitary, there might have been a small, secret linguistic focus group helping him refine his creation. Historians still argue whether the final structure of Esperanto was a sudden stroke of genius or the inevitable result of his long, iterative refinement process. Was there a specific aha moment when the core principles clicked? Or did they emerge gradually through years of trial and error? We might never know the exact moment the pieces fell into place, but we know the result was a language unlike any other, deliberately constructed, yet organic in its structure, simple yet expressive, and designed with a singular, profound purpose. He wasn't just creating a language, he was creating a potential solution to the world's most pressing problem, as he saw it. Every regular verb, every logical suffix, every internationally recognizable root word was a brick in the bridge he was trying to build between peoples. It was an act of immense faith, faith in the power of language, faith in the potential for human understanding, and faith that if he built this tool, people would pick it up and use it to build a better world. In a world rife with nationalistic fervor and linguistic snobbery, designing a language intended for everyone, free from national or cultural dominance, was a truly radical act of optimism. He was crafting not just words and rules, but hope itself, embedded in the very structure of this new universal tongue. So, you've seen the tireless work, the late nights, the linguistic surgery Zamenhof performed to craft his universal tongue. Years passed, filled with the quiet intensity of creation. He wasn't just building a language, he was assembling a vessel for his deepest hopes. And finally, in 1887, the moment arrived. The language was ready to leave the notebooks and step out into the world. Imagine the scene. It's July, perhaps a humid summer day. A small, unassuming book is printed. It's not a grand, leather-bound volume. It's a modest pamphlet or thin book, likely printed on relatively cheap paper. The full title in Russian was International Language, Forward and Complete Textbook. But the name that would stick, The name the world would come to know the language by wasn't on the cover as the language's official title. It was the pseudonym of the author, Doctoro Esperanto. This pseudonym wasn't just a pen name to protect his identity, though that was likely a factor. Launching such a radical idea could attract unwanted attention. It was a statement of intent. Esperanto, in the new language, means one who hopes. By naming himself Dr. Hope, Zamenhof wasn't just presenting a language, he was embodying the very spirit behind it. He was the physician prescribing hope for a fractured world. It's a level of symbolic naming that feels almost poetic, doesn't it? Like a superhero origin story, but instead of a cape, he wore a doctor's coat and wielded grammar rules. This quirky tidbit, the very name of the language coming from the author's hopeful pseudonym, is a powerful encapsulation of the entire movement's ethos. The book itself was incredibly practical. It contained a concise grammar, just 16 rules, presented with remarkable clarity. Remember those endless exceptions and irregular verbs we talked about? Gone. Zamenhof laid out a system so logical, so internally consistent, that you could genuinely learn the fundamentals in a matter of hours or days, not months or years. It included a dictionary of around 900 root words, chosen for their internationality and potential to be combined using prefixes and suffixes to create a vast vocabulary. It also included example texts, translations of proverbs, and crucially, a translation of the Lord's Prayer and a poem titled La Espero, the Hope. La Espero became, in many ways, the anthem of the early movement. It spoke of a world united by a common language, where barriers fall and understanding reigns. It wasn't just a linguistic exercise, it was a manifesto for a peaceful, interconnected future. The book wasn't saying, "Here's a cool new code." It was saying, "Here is the tool that can help us end war, overcome prejudice, and build a global family." The optimism wasn't hidden, it was the core message, emblazoned on the author's chosen name, and woven into the very first words published in the language. Think about the sheer audacity of this act. In a world carved up by empires, bristling with nationalistic pride, and where linguistic difference was actively used to reinforce social hierarchies and political boundaries, a young doctor publishes a book offering a language explicitly designed to erase those boundaries. It was an act of profound, almost defiant optimism. He wasn't just hoping for peace. He was actively building the infrastructure he believed would make peace possible. It's like seeing a problem like a leaky faucet and deciding the best solution is to invent a whole new plumbing system for the entire building. Ambitious, to say the least. Historians still argue whether Zamenhof genuinely believed language was the primary cause of conflict, or if he saw it as the most leverageable point to address deeper issues. Was his optimism purely about linguistic unity? Or was language merely the vehicle for a broader social and political vision? Regardless, the message delivered in Unio Libro was crystal clear. The confusion of tongues is a curse, a barrier to human brotherhood, and here, in these pages, is the key to overcoming it. The book was initially published in Russian, Zamenhof's country's dominant language, but translations quickly followed into Polish, German, French, and English. The very act of translating the book into multiple languages to explain the language designed to replace the need for extensive translation is a historical irony that feels almost like a setup for a joke. Okay, so here's the book about the language that makes translation easy, translated into 5 languages so you can read about it. The cost of printing the first edition reportedly came from Zamenhof's future father-in-law, who provided the funds, perhaps seeing potential in the project or simply wanting to support his daughter's fiancé's peculiar obsession. This reliance on personal funds highlights how grassroots and non-commercial the initial launch was. It wasn't backed by a government or a major institution. It was a personal dream, financed by a hopeful relative. The publication of Unio Libro was not a global sensation overnight. It was a quiet ripple, a seed planted in fertile ground but needing time to sprout. It wasn't reviewed in major newspapers immediately, and it certainly didn't cause heads of state to suddenly embrace universal brotherhood. But for those who encountered it, often through quiet channels, it offered something powerful, a concrete tool, a practical pathway for realizing that deep human yearning for connection across divides. It was a tangible piece of hope, bound in paper and ink, offering a way to speak to the other, not as a foreigner, but as a fellow human being. This little book, born from years of solitary work and fueled by an unwavering belief in the potential for human harmony, was the first step in turning one man's radical dream into a global movement. So, you've got the picture. Zamenhof, the young doctor, the hopeful dreamer, has just unleashed a new libro onto the world, carrying his meticulously crafted language. But what was this language, this international language, from Dr. Esperanto, that held so much promise? Let's peel back the cover of that little book and look inside, shall we? Imagine you're one of the first people to pick it up, maybe a merchant in Warsaw, a scholar in Paris, or a curious reader in London, wrestling with the complexities of learning foreign tongues for trade or study. You open this book, and what you find is surprisingly simple. The core of Esperanto's ingenious design lies in its radical regularity and logical structure. Zamenhof wasn't just simplifying, he was rationalizing language itself. He presented a grammar built on just 16 fundamental rules. 16! Think about that for a second. The grammar of English, for instance, isn't neatly codified into a specific number of rules. It's a vast, sprawling landscape of guidelines, exceptions, idioms, and historical baggage. Trying to list all the rules of English grammar would probably require a book thicker than your pillow. 16 rules for Esperanto? It felt revolutionary. This mainstream historical fact, the famous 16 rules, *deca cs reguloj*, was a cornerstone of its appeal, suggesting a language that was not only learnable but almost masterable in its basic structure. And then there was the spelling and pronunciation. Oh, the sweet, sweet relief of it. Esperanto is almost perfectly phonetic. Every letter has one sound, and every sound is represented by one letter. No silent letters, no weird diphthongs that change meaning based on the phase of the moon, no deciding whether C sounds like K or S. You see a word, you know how to say it. You hear a word, you know how to spell it. It's the linguistic equivalent of finding a perfectly organized sock drawer after years of chaotic laundry piles. This phonetic simplicity was a deliberate design choice to make the language accessible to speakers of any background, removing one of the biggest hurdles in language learning. Imagine never having to ask, "How do you spell that?" ever again. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? Vocabulary was another stroke of genius. Zamenhof didn't invent words out of thin air, mostly. He borrowed root words from languages he believed would be familiar to a wide audience, primarily European ones like Latin, French, German, and English. So, words like domo, house, from Latin/romance, libro, book, from Latin/romance, lerni, to learn, from German lernen, and granda, large, from romance, populated the language. This gave Esperanto a slightly familiar ring to many Europeans, making the initial vocabulary acquisition much faster. But he wasn't just copying, he was standardizing. He applied his phonetic spelling and consistent endings to these roots, smoothing out the irregularities. The real power, however, lay in its morphology, how words are built. This is where agglutination comes in. Think of roots as base ingredients, and prefixes/suffixes as linguistic spices and modifiers. You take a root, say san, health. Add a for the adjective, sana, healthy. Add o for the noun, sano, health. Add eg, to cause to be sanegi, to heal someone. Add mal, opposite malsana, sick. Add yulo, person characterized by malsanilo, a sick person. You could build an entire family of related words from a single root. This dramatically reduced the number of individual root words you needed to memorize. With a relatively small vocabulary of roots and a set of standard affixes, prefixes and suffixes, you could understand and construct thousands of words. It's like having a universal set of Legos where you can build anything you can imagine with a limited number of brick types. This system made the language incredibly flexible and expressive, capable of nuance and abstraction, despite its small core vocabulary. A quirky tidbit that highlights this: Esperanto has a specific prefix, mal, That means the direct opposite. So, if bona is good, malbona is bad. If granda is big, malgranda is small. If rica is rich, malrica is poor. It's a simple, elegant way to double your vocabulary with minimal effort, and it feels delightfully logical. Historians still argue whether Zamenhof's choice to base vocabulary primarily on European languages was a pragmatic necessity to give the language a head start with a large potential user base, or if it inadvertently embedded a European bias into a language intended to be neutral and universal. Could he have drawn more equally from Asian, African, or indigenous languages? Perhaps, but the practicality of reaching his initial target audience in Europe and the Americas likely guided his choices. The design wasn't just about mechanics, it was deeply intertwined with the optimistic philosophy. By making the language easy, regular, and neutral, Zamenhof was expressing a profound belief that linguistic barriers were artificial and surmountable, and that people, given a fair and equal tool, would choose to connect. The ease of learning wasn't just a technical feature, it was an invitation, a promise that the path to global understanding wasn't reserved for linguistic geniuses or the privileged elite. It was accessible to everyone. This design was, in itself, an act of hope, a physical manifestation of the idea that unity could be built through shared, simple tools. It was a language designed for friendship, for breaking down walls, for proving that humanity had more in common than what separated it. Every regular verb, every logical suffix, every internationally recognizable root word was a tiny vote of confidence in the potential for human cooperation. And this carefully crafted linguistic machine was about to be put to the test. So, you've got the picture. Zamenhof, the young doctor, the hopeful dreamer, has just unleashed un nuevo libro onto the world, carrying his meticulously crafted language. But what was this language, this international language, from Dr. Esperanto, that held so much promise? Let's peel back the cover of that little book and look inside, shall we? Imagine you're one of the first people to pick it up, maybe a merchant in Warsaw, a scholar in Paris, or a curious reader in London, wrestling with the complexities of learning foreign tongues for trade or study. You open this book, and what you find is, surprisingly simple. The core of Esperanto's ingenious design lies in its radical regularity and logical structure. Zamenhof wasn't just simplifying, he was rationalizing language itself. He presented a grammar built on just 16 fundamental rules. 16! Think about that for a second. The grammar of English, for instance, isn't neatly codified into a specific number of rules. It's a vast, sprawling landscape of guidelines, exceptions, idioms, and historical baggage. Trying to list all the rules of English grammar would probably require a book thicker than your pillow. 16 rules for Esperanto? It felt revolutionary. This mainstream historical fact, the famous 16 rules, *dec cs reguloj*, was a cornerstone of its appeal, suggesting a language that was not only learnable but almost masterable in its basic structure. And then there was the spelling and pronunciation. Oh, the sweet, sweet relief of it. Esperanto is almost perfectly phonetic. Every letter has one sound, and every sound is represented by one letter. No silent letters, no weird diphthongs that change meaning based on the phase of the moon, no deciding whether C sounds like K or S. You see a word, you know how to say it. You hear a word, you know how to spell it. It's the linguistic equivalent of finding a perfectly organized sock drawer after years of chaotic laundry piles. This phonetic simplicity was a deliberate design choice to make the language accessible to speakers of any background, removing one of the biggest hurdles in language learning. Imagine never having to ask, "How do you spell that?" ever again. It's a beautiful thought, isn't it? Vocabulary was another stroke of genius. Zamenhof didn't invent words out of thin air, mostly. He borrowed root words from languages he believed would be familiar to a wide audience, primarily European ones like Latin, French, German, and English. So, words like domo, house, from Latin/romance, libro, book, from Latin/romance, lerni, to learn, from German lernen, and granda, large, from romance, populated the language. This gave Esperanto a slightly familiar ring to many Europeans, making the initial vocabulary acquisition much faster. But he wasn't just copying, he was standardizing. He applied his phonetic spelling and consistent endings to these roots, smoothing out the irregularities. The real power, however, lay in its morphology, how words are built. This is where agglutination comes in. Think of roots as base ingredients, and prefixes/suffixes as linguistic spices and modifiers. You take a root, say san, health. Add a for the adjective, sana, healthy. Add o for the noun, sano, health. Add eg, to cause to be sanagi, to heal someone. Add mal, opposite malsana, sick. Add yulo, person characterized by malsanilo, a sick person. You could build an entire family of related words from a single root. This dramatically reduced the number of individual root words you needed to memorize. With a relatively small vocabulary of roots and a set of standard affixes, prefixes and suffixes, you could understand and construct thousands of words. It's like having a universal set of Legos where you can build anything you can imagine with a limited number of brick types. This system made the language incredibly flexible and expressive, capable of nuance and abstraction, despite its small core vocabulary. A quirky tidbit that highlights this: Esperanto has a specific prefix, mal, that means the direct opposite. So if bona is good, malbona is bad. If granda is big, malgranda is small. If rica is rich, malrica is poor. It's a simple, elegant way to double your vocabulary with minimal effort, and it feels delightfully logical. Historians still argue whether Zamenhof's choice to base vocabulary primarily on European languages was a pragmatic necessity to give the language a head start with a large potential user base, or if it inadvertently embedded a European bias into a language intended to be neutral and universal. Could he have drawn more equally from Asian, African, or indigenous languages? Perhaps, but the practicality of reaching his initial target audience in Europe and the Americas likely guided his choices. The design wasn't just about mechanics, it was deeply intertwined with the optimistic philosophy. By making the language easy, regular, and neutral, Zamenhof was expressing a profound belief that linguistic barriers were artificial and surmountable, and that people, given a fair and equal tool, would choose to connect. The ease of learning wasn't just a technical feature, it was an invitation, a promise that the path to global understanding wasn't reserved for linguistic geniuses or the privileged elite. It was accessible to everyone. This design was, in itself, an act of hope, a physical manifestation of the idea that unity could be built through shared, simple tools. It was a language designed for friendship, for breaking down walls, for proving that humanity had more in common than what separated it. Every regular verb, every logical suffix, every internationally recognizable root word was a tiny vote of confidence in the potential for human cooperation. And this carefully crafted linguistic machine was about to be put to the test. Now, imagine you are Zamenhof, sitting in Białystok, or perhaps Warsaw by this time, having just published your life's work. You don't have the internet, no social media, no mass advertising campaigns. How do you tell the world? You use the technology of the day, the postal service. Zamenhof began mailing copies of Unua Libro to individuals, organizations, and libraries he thought might be interested in the idea of an international language. He sent them to scholars, journalists, politicians, pacifist groups, and anyone who had previously published or expressed interest in the concept. It was a scattershot approach, a hopeful casting of seeds onto potentially fertile ground across continents. Think about the sheer act of faith involved in this. You've poured years into creating this language, you believe it holds the key to world peace, and your distribution strategy is putting books in envelopes and trusting the mail carriers of various empires to deliver them. It feels incredibly quaint from today's perspective, where a single viral tweet can reach millions instantly. Zamenhof's initial reach was measured in dozens, maybe hundreds, of carefully addressed envelopes. This slow, deliberate mailing of the first copies of Unua Libro to potential sympathizers and opinion makers across Europe and beyond was the primary method of disseminating the language in its earliest days. It wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a quiet, patient spread, one letter carrier at a time. And then, something remarkable started to happen. Amidst the vast majority of people who likely received the book and promptly ignored it, or perhaps scoffed at the idea, a tiny fraction were intrigued. Imagine one of those books landing on the desk of a professor in Germany, or a businessman in France, or a writer in England. They open the book, see the name, Dr. Esperanto, meaning Dr. Hope, and read the introduction, which lays out the problem of linguistic division and presents this simple, logical solution. They look at the 16 rules, the phonetic spelling, the clever word-building system. And for some, a spark ignited. These early adopters weren't necessarily linguistic experts, though some were. They were often idealists, people who shared Zamenhof's yearning for a more peaceful, connected world. They were individuals frustrated by the barriers to international communication, whether for scientific exchange, trade, travel, or simply understanding their neighbors. The promise of a language that was easy to learn, neutral, and specifically designed for international use resonated deeply with their own hopes and frustrations. It wasn't just a linguistic tool they found, it was a shared vision. A quirky tidbit from this period involves the back of Un Libro. Zamenhof included a promise coupon. Readers were encouraged to cut it out and mail it back to him if they learned the language and promised to try and use it. This sounds incredibly formal and a little adorable now. Imagine signing a legal-style promise to speak a language. It was a way for Zamenhof to gauge interest and identify his first followers, creating a tangible link between the author and the scattered readers. It highlights the personal, almost contractual nature of joining this nascent movement. Historians still argue whether the initial appeal of Esperanto was primarily its linguistic simplicity and practicality, or the powerful, idealistic message of peace and unity embedded within it. Was it the elegant design that attracted the first followers, or the hope it represented? It was likely a potent combination, but the emphasis on hope and brotherhood was undeniably a major draw for many in that politically charged era. The people who responded to that call, who sent back their promise, coupons, or wrote letters to Dr. Esperanto, were taking a small leap of faith. They were investing their time and effort in a language that had no native speakers, no established literature, yet, and was widely unknown or mocked. They were joining a movement that existed, at this point, mostly in the pages of a single book and the hopeful mind of its author. They were the true pioneers, the first scattered seeds of Dr. Hope's garden, beginning to sprout in isolated locations around the globe, united only by a small book and a surprisingly optimistic idea. This was the quiet beginning of something much larger, a testament to the power of a simple message and a well-designed tool finding their way into the right hands at the right time. So, you've seen the little book, Un Libro, fluttering out into the world like paper birds, carried by the postal service to scattered individuals across continents. You've imagined the spark of hope it ignited in those first few who bothered to open it, read the 16 rules, and grasp the elegant logic of Dr. Hope's language. But these weren't just isolated sparks, they were embers waiting to be fanned into a flame. The big question was, how did these solitary learners, often living hundreds or even thousands of miles apart, find each other and form a community? Remember, this is the late 19th century. No email, no social media, no instant messaging. Connecting meant writing letters, sealing them with wax, maybe, sticking on a stamp, and waiting weeks, perhaps months, for a reply. The primary method of connecting these early believers was, quite simply, the post. Those who sent back their promise, coupons, or simply wrote letters to Zamenhof expressing their interest, were put in touch with other like-minded individuals in their region or country, or even internationally if they were adventurous. Imagine the excitement of receiving a letter from a complete stranger in another country, a letter written entirely in this new, shared language you were just starting to learn. It wasn't just communication, it was confirmation that you weren't alone, that this hopeful dream was taking root elsewhere too. These letters became precious artifacts, filled with awkward grammar and limited vocabulary at first, but overflowing with shared enthusiasm and mutual encouragement. They were building connections, word by painstakingly written word. This network of correspondence was the lifeblood of the nascent movement. People exchanged lessons, practiced writing, shared ideas, and simply reveled in the novelty of conversing across national boundaries without resorting to a dominant national language. It was a practical demonstration of Esperanto's core promise. A quirky tidbit that highlights this early reliance on mail: Zamenhof himself spent an enormous amount of time and personal funds acting as a central switchboard, manually connecting people via correspondence. He received letters from learners, noted their locations and interests, and then wrote back suggesting others they could contact. He was the human algorithm of the early Esperanto network, powered by ink and paper. It must have been an exhausting job, essentially running a global pen pal club by hand. But letter writing, while vital, was slow and limited. To truly grow and sustain a movement, a more centralized form of communication was needed. This is where the first Esperanto journals and magazines became crucial. The first significant one, La Esperantisto, The Esperantist, began publication in 1889 in Nuremberg, Germany, edited by a man named Ludwig Keller. This journal wasn't just a collection of articles, it was the central hub for the scattered community. It published news about the language's spread, provided language lessons and grammar explanations, featured original poetry and prose written in Esperanto, and most importantly, it published lists of Esperantists and their addresses who were willing to correspond. This practice of publishing lists of speakers was a mainstream historical fact of the early movement. It might seem strange to us today to publicly list your address for strangers around the world, but in that era, it was a key way to find others who shared this niche interest. La Esperantisto and subsequent journals acted as bulletin boards and meeting points, transforming isolated learners into a connected network. Reading the journal allowed you to feel part of something larger, to see that there were others like you in distant lands, all united by this shared language and shared hope. It provided a sense of collective identity and purpose. As the number of Esperantists grew, particularly in urban centers, letter writing and reading journals weren't enough. People wanted to meet face to face, to hear the language spoken, to practice conversation in person. This led to the formation of the first local Esperanto clubs and societies. These started small, often just a few people meeting in someone's home or a local cafe. They would practice speaking, read texts together, maybe even translate local poems or songs into Esperanto. These clubs became vital nodes in the network, providing a sense of local community within the larger global movement. They were places where the abstract idea of a universal language became a lived, social reality. Imagine the nervous excitement of attending one of these first meetings, perhaps unsure if you'd understood the invitation correctly, and then the relief and joy of hearing others speak the language, however haltingly. Historians still argue whether these early clubs were primarily driven by the practical desire to practice the language, or by the ideological commitment to the movement's goals of peace and internationalism. Was it the tool that brought people together, or the shared vision? It was likely a mix, but the social aspect, the sheer novelty and pleasure of connecting with diverse people through a shared, neutral medium, cannot be overstated. For many, these clubs were a tangible embodiment of the hopeful future Zamenhof envisioned. These early networks, the postal correspondence, the international journals, the local clubs, were the infrastructure of optimism. They were the threads weaving together the scattered believers into a coherent movement. They demonstrated that Esperanto wasn't just a theoretical construct. It was a living, breathing language capable of fostering real human connection across the very divides it was designed to bridge. It was a testament to the power of a shared idea and a practical tool to overcome the inertia and skepticism of the wider world. These pioneers, writing awkward letters and meeting in drafty rooms, were quietly building the foundation for something that would, against all odds, endure. So, you've seen the threads of this hopeful movement being woven, letter by letter, journal by journal, meeting by quiet meeting in scattered corners of the world. These early Esperantists, these pioneers of internationalism, were finding each other, building a network of shared language and shared dreams. But while corresponding and meeting in small local groups was powerful, there was a growing yearning for something more, something that would prove, undeniably, that this wasn't just a scattered collection of individuals, but a real, living community capable of gathering, connecting, and functioning on a truly international scale. They wanted to see the dream made flesh, to hear the universal language echoing not just in their own small club meetings, but in a grander, global setting. This yearning culminated in an audacious plan, the first ever World Congress of Esperanto. Think about the logistics in 1905. Getting people from dozens of different countries, speaking potentially dozens of different native languages, to travel across borders that were often guarded by suspicious authorities, converge in one place, and attempt to communicate only in this new, artificial language? It sounds like a logistical nightmare wrapped in a diplomatic tightrope walk. But the optimism of the movement, the sheer belief in the possibility, propelled them forward. The chosen location for this historic gathering was Boulogne-sur-Mer, a coastal town in northern France. Why Boulogne-sur-Mer? It was relatively accessible from several European countries, and crucially, the local authorities and populace were welcoming to the idea. This wasn't just a random choice. It was a deliberate attempt to find a neutral, friendly ground for this unprecedented meeting. And so, in August 1905, people began to arrive. Imagine the scene: train stations and docks filling with individuals carrying their copies of Un Nuevo Libro or La Esperantisto, perhaps looking around nervously, wondering if anyone else there shared their secret language. Then, a tentative greeting. Salutin! Hello? Met with a hopeful smile and a reply in the same tongue. The relief, the sheer joy of that first easy conversation with a complete stranger from a different country, speaking a language you both learned specifically to meet on neutral ground, must have been electric. This gathering in Boulogne-sur-Mer in August 1905 is the mainstream historical fact marking the moment the scattered seeds truly began to coalesce into a visible global community. Over 680 people from 20 different countries attended. Think about that diversity: Russians, French, Germans, British, Americans, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Belgians, and many more, all coming together, united by a shared linguistic key. The official language of the entire Congress was Esperanto. Every speech, every discussion, every announcement, all in Esperanto. For the attendees, many of whom had only ever read or written the language, hearing hundreds of people speaking it around them must have been an overwhelming, exhilarating experience. It wasn't just theory anymore. It was sound, it was conversation, it was life. It proved that the language worked, not just for letters, but for complex, real-time human interaction. Zamenhof himself was there, of course. He gave a powerful opening speech, delivered entirely in Esperanto, which is now considered a foundational text of the movement's philosophy. He spoke not just of the language, but of the underlying, internal idea, the spirit of brotherhood and peace it represented. It was a moment of immense personal triumph for him, seeing his lifelong dream take such a tangible, vibrant form. However, a quirky tidbit about Zamenhof is that despite being the creator and figurehead, he was reportedly quite a shy and nervous public speaker. Imagine pouring your heart and soul into a project for decades, finally seeing it celebrated on a global stage, and feeling utterly terrified about getting up in front of everyone to talk about it. It adds a touch of relatable humanity to the almost mythical figure he became for his followers. The Congress wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. Attendees discussed the future of the language and the movement. They established organizations and made plans for future collaboration. It was a working meeting, but imbued with an almost utopian atmosphere. People weren't just speaking Esperanto, they were living the ideal it represented, connecting across national identities, finding common ground, and working together towards a shared goal. It felt like a glimpse into the future Zamenhof had envisioned, a future where linguistic barriers no longer fueled mistrust, but a shared language fostered understanding and cooperation. Historians still argue whether the enthusiasm generated at the first Congress was primarily due to the inherent appeal of the language itself, or the powerful idealism and hope for peace that the movement embodied, especially in the tense political climate leading up to World War I. Was it the tool or the dream that drew people? It's likely both were inseparable, but the sheer emotional impact of seeing so many diverse people communicating easily and joyfully in Esperanto cannot be underestimated in fueling the movement's early momentum. The success of the first Congress in Boulogne-sur-Mer sent shockwaves, albeit small ones, carried by the slow news cycles of the time, through the networks of early Esperantists. It wasn't just Dr. Esperanto's dream anymore. It was their shared reality. They had proven that it was possible to build a bridge of words strong enough to hold the weight of hundreds of diverse individuals, allowing them to meet, speak, and understand each other as equals. It was a powerful validation of Zamenhof's surprising optimism, a moment where the abstract hope bound in Unio Libro burst forth into the vibrant, multi-voiced reality of a global community. It was a dream realized, a testament to the enduring power of an idea whose time, its proponents believed, had finally come. So, the first Congress in Boulogne-sur-Mer was a triumph, a moment where the abstract dream of a universal language became a loud, joyful reality for hundreds of people. You saw it happen, felt the energy of that gathering. But here's the thing about building something new and vibrant. Once it starts to grow, you have to figure out how to make it stable, how to ensure it doesn't just dissolve into chaos as more people adopt it. Imagine building that beautiful bridge of words, only to have everyone start adding their own planks and bolts in different styles, making it wobbly and unsafe. The early Esperanto movement, high on the success of the Congress, faced this very practical challenge: how to secure the language itself against uncontrolled change. Because as the language spread, people naturally had ideas. Wouldn't it be better if we said this word slightly differently? Or, this grammar rule feels a bit awkward, let's tweak it. In natural languages, this kind of evolution happens organically over centuries, sometimes resulting in dialects that are mutually unintelligible. Just try understanding Chaucer. But for a planned language designed for global unity, uncontrolled divergence was an existential threat. If everyone started changing it, the whole point, easy, stable, universal communication, would be lost. It would be like everyone agreeing to use the metric system for world trade, and then half the countries decide to measure length in smoots and weight in bananas. The initial unity would vanish. Zamenhof, with his characteristic foresight, had anticipated this. Even before the first Congress, he understood that the language needed a solid, unchangeable foundation. He couldn't be the eternal linguistic dictator, constantly approving or rejecting changes. The language had to belong to the community, but the community needed a fixed reference point. His solution was the Fundamento de Esperanto, the foundation of Esperanto, formally established and ratified at that very first Congress in Boulogne-sur-Mer. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Fundamento was created to be the official, unchanging basis of the language. What is the Fundamento? It's not a new book. It's essentially a compilation of the core elements of the language as presented in those crucial early publications. It includes the original 16 grammar rules, a basic dictionary of root words, and a collection of example texts, including the Unio Libro itself and other early writings. The key principle was that these elements were declared sacrosanct. They could not be changed. They were the bedrock. You could add new words to the language as needed, for new technologies, concepts, etc., and the language could grow and evolve on top of this foundation, but you could never alter the foundation itself. It was like saying, here is the original blueprint and the basic building materials. You can build any kind of house you want on this plot, but the foundation stays exactly as it is. Zamenhof made a crucial, almost unprecedented step here. He formally renounced his personal authority over the language. He declared that only the Fundamento held ultimate authority, not him. He was no longer the master of Esperanto. He was just one speaker among many. This act of relinquishing control was incredibly significant and deeply aligned with the movement's anti-authoritarian, neutral principles. It ensured that the language wouldn't be tied to the whims or ideas of a single person, even its brilliant creator. It was a language of the people, designed to be for the people, and now formally governed by the people, albeit through a fixed text. A quirky tidbit about this is that Zamenhof felt so strongly about the Fundamento's untouchability that he stated if any part of it were ever proven to be genuinely flawed or detrimental, it would still be better to stick to the Fundamento than to risk linguistic anarchy by allowing free-for-all changes. That's commitment to stability. But simply having a fixed text wasn't enough for ongoing development. Language is a living thing. It needs to grow, add new words, define usage. This is where the Lingua Comitato, Language Committee, came in. Also established around the time of the First Congress, the Lingua Comitato was envisioned as a group of elected Esperantists from different countries, tasked with overseeing the future evolution of the language. Their job was to propose and approve new root words as they became necessary, clarify usage, and generally guide the language's growth in a standardized way, always respecting the principles and vocabulary laid out in the Fundamento. This committee was the steering wheel for the language's journey, ensuring it stayed on course and didn't veer off into a ditch of dialects. Think of the Fundamento as the Constitution and the Lingua Comitato as the legislative body and Supreme Court. The Constitution, Fundamento, is fixed and supreme. The body, Comitato, makes laws, adds new words, clarifies usage, that must always be in harmony with the Constitution. This two-tiered system was incredibly effective in providing both stability and flexibility. It allowed Esperanto to adapt to the changing world while remaining fundamentally the same language for everyone, everywhere. It's a level of linguistic planning that makes designing a new operating system look simple. Historians still argue whether the strict adherence to the Fundamento, while ensuring stability, might have also made the language less adaptable or slower to incorporate genuinely useful linguistic innovations that emerged organically from the community. Was the trade-off between total stability and potential organic improvement worth it? It's a debate that continues to this day, particularly regarding how new vocabulary is officially incorporated. The establishment of the Fundamento and the Lingua Comitato was another profound expression of the optimism behind the movement. It wasn't just about creating a language, it was about creating an institution for a language, trusting a global, diverse committee to guide its future, and believing that a fixed, neutral foundation could prevent the linguistic bickering and fragmentation that plagued natural languages. It was a bet on rational cooperation over linguistic nationalism, a belief that humanity, given the right tools and framework, could collectively manage its shared linguistic future for the common good. It was a quiet, administrative act, but one loaded with immense hope for a stable, unified linguistic future. So, you've seen the dream take shape, the language built brick by logical brick, the community connected letter by letter, and finally, the vibrant proof of concept at that first Congress in Boulogne-sur-Mer. Inside the bubble of the early movement, buoyed by the success of 1905 and the solid foundation of the Fundamento, the optimism felt utterly justified. They had created a working tool for international understanding, and they had a growing community ready to use it. Surely, the world would see the light, right? The benefits were so obvious: ease of learning, neutrality, a bridge between peoples. It felt like an unstoppable idea whose time had come. But step outside that bubble, back into the rough and tumble of the real world, and you'd quickly encounter a very different reaction. The early Esperanto movement, despite its internal triumphs, faced significant headwinds from skepticism, indifference, and outright mockery. Imagine trying to explain this to your neighbor in London, or your colleague in Berlin in the early 1900s. Oh yes, you might say, I'm learning a new language. It was created by a doctor in Russia. It only has 16 grammar rules, and it's going to unite the world. You'd likely be met with a blank stare, perhaps a polite nod, or more probably, a chuckle. The idea of an artificial language, deliberately constructed rather than having evolved naturally, struck many people as fundamentally strange, even absurd. Languages, they believed, were organic things, tied to culture, history, and national identity. The notion of a neutral, rootless language felt unnatural, like trying to grow a plant without soil. It was easy fodder for jokes and derision. The skepticism wasn't confined to the man on the street. Many established linguistic experts and academics were deeply dismissive. They viewed Esperanto with suspicion, seeing it as a simplistic, even naive, attempt to replace the rich complexity of natural languages. They pointed out its relatively small vocabulary compared to major world languages, though the agglutinative structure allowed for expansion, questioned its capacity for deep expression, which early Esperantists eagerly worked to prove through translation and original works, and generally regarded it as a linguistic curiosity, a utopian folly rather than a serious contender for international communication. To many academics, it felt like an engineer trying to redesign a forest. They respected the intricate, messy beauty of natural evolution over planned construction. This dismissal by a significant portion of the linguistic establishment was a mainstream historical fact that the early movement had to contend with. Their lack of academic endorsement made it harder to gain mainstream credibility. The press, ever ready to seize on something unusual or potentially ridiculous, often treated Esperanto with amusement or contempt. Newspaper articles sometimes portrayed Esperantists as eccentric idealists, harmless dreamers disconnected from reality. Cartoons might depict people speaking in gibberish, or show the language failing spectacularly in practical situations. This public mockery, while perhaps not stopping dedicated individuals, certainly made it difficult to attract wider support and painted the movement as something unserious, a hobby for cranks rather than a serious endeavor for global good. Imagine trying to build a global peace movement when the dominant narrative about your core tool is that it's a funny little made-up language spoken by weirdos. It required a thick skin and a deep well of that core optimism to keep going. There was also a more fundamental resistance rooted in national pride and cultural identity. For centuries, national languages had been symbols of sovereignty, history, and cultural uniqueness. The idea of adopting a neutral, international language felt, to some, like a threat to their own linguistic heritage and national identity. Why speak this artificial language when you could speak the glorious tongue of your ancestors, the language of Shakespeare, or Goethe, or Hugo? This sentiment was a powerful, often unspoken barrier. It wasn't just about communication, it was about belonging, and for many, belonging meant speaking their language. A quirky tidbit that highlights the level of mockery: one proposed alternative to Esperanto, called Volapük, which predated Esperanto but was still somewhat in competition initially, had a rather complicated structure and vocabulary that sounded very alien to European ears. When Esperanto came along, with its more familiar-sounding roots, some critics of both languages would lump them together and make fun of the very concept of artificial languages, sometimes using nonsensical phrases supposedly from these languages as punchlines. The early Esperantists had to constantly differentiate themselves from less successful or more complex predecessors while fighting the general perception that all artificial languages were doomed to fail or were inherently laughable. It was a tough crowd. Historians still argue whether the primary source of opposition to early Esperanto was purely linguistic and academic, stemming from a genuine belief that the language was flawed or the concept unsound, or if it was more deeply rooted in socio-political resistance to the internationalist ideals it represented. Was the mockery a genuine reaction to its perceived awkwardness, or a convenient way to dismiss a movement that challenged nationalistic norms and the status quo of linguistic power? It's likely a complex mix, but the fact remains that the early movement faced a constant uphill battle against the tide of indifference and ridicule. Despite the internal validation of the Congress and the stability provided by the Fundamento, the external world was largely unimpressed, often hostile. It took immense courage and unwavering belief for those early Esperantists to continue promoting a language that many considered a joke. They weren't just learning grammar, they were defying cultural norms, pushing back against ingrained skepticism, and holding on to that radical hope in the face of a cynical world. Every awkward conversation explaining why they were learning this made-up language, every dismissive article they read, every joke they overheard, was a test of their commitment. But the core optimism, the belief that a better, more connected world was possible through this linguistic tool, kept them going, even when the world seemed determined to laugh them into silence. They knew they were onto something real, something important, even if others couldn't see past the novelty of an artificial tongue. So you've weathered the gentle storm of skepticism and the annoying drizzle of mockery. You've seen the early Esperantists shrug off the eye rolls and the jokes, buoyed by the success of their Congress and the sheer logic of their language. But as the movement grew, attracting more diverse people across more borders, the reaction from the powers that be began to shift from mere amusement to something far more chilling: suspicion. Imagine you are a government official in, say, the German Empire or the Russian Empire in the years leading up to World War I. Tensions are rising, alliances are shifting, and national security is paramount. You get reports about groups of people in your country corresponding with people in other countries, meeting in secret clubs, and planning international gatherings, all communicating in a language you don't understand and can't easily monitor. This language isn't French, the language of diplomacy, but also a rival power, or German, a national language, or Russian. It's something new, something neutral, something international. And its stated goal is universal brotherhood and peace. From the perspective of a state primarily concerned with national interests, control, and potential conflict, this looks, well, suspicious. Why would people need a neutral language unless they had something to hide? Why promote brotherhood across borders when your job is to promote loyalty within your borders and suspicion towards others? The very ideals of the Esperanto movement, internationalism, neutrality, breaking down barriers between peoples, could be interpreted, through a paranoid lens, as anti-nationalist, potentially subversive, or even a cover for espionage. It challenged the fundamental idea that the nation-state was the highest form of human organization and that loyalty to one's own country trumped global solidarity. The mainstream historical fact here is that several governments, particularly in the years leading up to and during World War I, began to view the Esperanto movement with significant unease and sometimes actively monitored or restricted its activities. They weren't necessarily convinced Esperanto was some kind of secret code for spies, though that fear did pop up occasionally, but they were wary of any transnational movement that fostered connections and loyalties outside the direct control of the state. Esperanto clubs meeting quietly in a back room might not seem like a threat, but a network of such clubs across hostile nations, communicating freely, felt like a potential Trojan horse for unwelcome ideas or affiliations. It was like finding out your citizens were all joining a global book club, but the books were written in a language your censors couldn't read. Highly unnerving. Authorities worried about what was really being discussed in those international letters and congresses. Was it just poetry and grammar tips? Or were they coordinating political action? Spreading pacifist propaganda? Sharing industrial secrets? The neutrality of the language, intended to be a feature, became a bug in the eyes of suspicious governments. Because it wasn't tied to any one nation, it didn't inherently carry the cultural or political biases that governments could understand and often manipulate. It was a free space, and free spaces outside state control tend to make control-oriented regimes very nervous. Think about how some modern governments view encrypted messaging apps. Same principle, just with fountain pens and paper. Some governments suspected that Esperanto was a front for other, more overtly political movements, like socialism, anarchism, or pacifism. While many early Esperantists were indeed pacifists or had progressive political leanings, it's not a huge leap from "let's all be friends" to "let's stop fighting wars." The movement itself was officially politically neutral, focusing solely on the language and its cultural use. But in an era of heightened political tension, simply being associated with internationalism was enough to raise red flags. It didn't help that some individuals did use Esperanto to discuss these political ideas, blurring the lines in the eyes of external observers. A quirky tidbit related to this suspicion: some accounts suggest that postal censors in various countries struggled mightily with mail written in Esperanto. Since it wasn't a standard diplomatic or widely taught language, finding someone qualified to read and understand it could be a challenge. This unintentional linguistic security feature probably only increased the suspicion. If the spooks couldn't read it, it must be nefarious. Imagine a poor censor squinting at a letter filled with words like salutin, amico, and congresso, scratching their head, and just stamping it. Suspicious! Because they couldn't make heads or tails of it. It's almost comical, until you remember that suspicion could lead to real consequences for the sender or recipient. Historians still argue whether the political suspicion directed at Esperantists was primarily a reaction to the perceived threat of internationalism itself, regardless of the language, or if there was a genuine, albeit often unfounded, fear that Esperanto was being used as a tool for specific political subversion or espionage. Was it the message or the medium that spooked the governments? Was the language itself seen as dangerous, or merely the people who were drawn to its ideals and used it to connect outside national channels? This atmosphere of suspicion meant that being an active Esperantist could sometimes be risky. Government employees might be discouraged or forbidden from participating. Clubs might find it difficult to get official permission to meet. International travel for congresses could become more complicated, requiring extra scrutiny or facing outright denial. The movement, born from such open, hopeful ideals, found itself increasingly operating under a watchful, wary gaze. It was a stark contrast to the bright, open vision of universal understanding. Suddenly, the language of hope felt like it needed to be whispered in certain company. Despite this pressure, the early Esperantists largely held firm to their principles. They continued to advocate for the language as a neutral tool, emphasizing its cultural and practical benefits while trying to navigate the political minefield. They believed that the inherent goodness and utility of the language would eventually overcome these unfounded fears. It was another test of their profound optimism. Could the simple act of wanting to talk to people from other countries really be seen as a threat? And could their peaceful, linguistic movement withstand the heavy hand of state suspicion? They were about to find out, as the world tilted closer and closer to the brink of global conflict, a conflict that would test the limits of their hopeful vision in ways they could barely imagine. You saw the suspicion grow, the wary glances from officials, the quiet unease surrounding this movement built on transparency and connection. But all that suspicion, all that political tension simmering beneath the surface of early 20th century Europe, was just the rumbling before the earthquake. Because in 1914, the world that Zamenhof had so desperately hoped to unite through language shattered into a million pieces. The outbreak of the First World War was not just a political and human catastrophe. It was a direct, brutal assault on the very core optimistic belief that fueled the early Esperanto movement. The idea that linguistic understanding could prevent war and foster universal peace. Imagine the shock, the despair, among those who had dedicated themselves to building bridges of words across nations. They had believed that if only people could talk to each other, truly understand each other, the senseless violence of war would become unthinkable. And then the cannons roared. French soldiers who spoke Esperanto found themselves facing German soldiers who spoke Esperanto, not with a shared greeting of "Salutin," but with bayonets and bullets. The language designed for brotherhood was suddenly trapped in the mud of the trenches, rendered tragically irrelevant by the overwhelming force of national hatred and political ambition. This period, marked by the outbreak of World War I in 1914, is a mainstream historical fact that represents the most significant early challenge and test to the fundamental optimistic premise of the Esperanto movement. The war didn't just pause the movement, it seemed to invalidate its central tenet. The practical impact was immediate and devastating. The vibrant network of international correspondence, the lifeblood of the movement, was severed. Letters stopped flowing across borders. Censorship tightened, making any communication with citizens of enemy nations suspect, even if it was just about grammar or poetry. Suddenly, that handy list of international addresses you might have kept felt less like a pen pal directory and more like a potential enemy contact list. It was a stark, brutal reminder that while language could connect, political systems could just as easily isolate and divide, often using language itself as a tool of propaganda and dehumanization. The annual World Congresses, those powerful symbols of global unity that had started so triumphantly in Boulogne-sur-Mer, had to stop. There was no gathering people from warring nations in one place to sing La Espero and discuss universal peace when their countries were locked in a death struggle. The journals and magazines, which had been the central nervous system of the community, either ceased publication entirely or, in some cases, were forced to adopt a fiercely nationalistic tone, a complete betrayal of the language's neutral, internationalist spirit. It was like watching your favorite band suddenly start playing jingoistic military marches instead of their usual harmonious tunes. For individual Esperantists, the war presented a profound moral and personal crisis. Many were pacifists, drawn to the movement precisely because of its anti-war message. Now, they were conscripted into armies, ordered to fight and kill the very people they had corresponded with, whose Esperanto letters they might still carry in their pockets. How could you reconcile the ideal of universal brotherhood with the reality of trench warfare? Some tried to maintain contact across the lines, acts of quiet defiance that were incredibly risky. Others, sadly, succumbed to the intense nationalistic fervor of the time, their Esperanto ideals overwhelmed by wartime propaganda and pressure. The community was fractured, forced to choose sides in a conflict that their shared language was supposed to make impossible. A quirky tidbit that highlights the personal tragedy of this period: Zamenhof himself, living in Warsaw, a city caught between empires and suffering greatly during the war, was heartbroken by the conflict. In 1914, shortly after the war began, he wrote a poignant, almost desperate appeal for peace, titled "Al Voco al la dum batalantage popoloj," appealed to the peoples fighting each other. In it he lamented that the wild beast of international hatred had overpowered reason and justice. He died in 1917, before the war ended, having witnessed the horrifying failure of his generation to achieve the peace he had dedicated his life to building. It's a tragic irony that the Doctor of Hope died in the midst of such profound global despair. Historians still argue whether the failure of Esperanto to prevent World War I proved the language project was fundamentally flawed in its core premise about language and peace, or if it simply showed the overwhelming power of political and economic forces that language alone could never overcome. Was the dream naive from the start, or was it simply crushed by forces far greater than linguistic understanding? The war certainly provided ammunition for the skeptics and cynics who had dismissed the movement as utopian fantasy. They could point to the millions dead and say, "See? Your little language didn't stop anything." The war was a brutal test of the early Esperantists' optimism. It forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that while language barriers contribute to misunderstanding, they are not the only, or perhaps even the primary, cause of conflict. Hatred, greed, power struggles, and nationalistic ideologies run deep, and a shared vocabulary, however elegant, is not necessarily a shield against them. It was a period of immense disillusionment and loss. The bright, hopeful vision of a united world speaking one language seemed to fade into the smoke and chaos of the battlefield. The movement didn't disappear entirely, but its international activities were crippled, its community scattered, and its core optimistic premise severely challenged by the grim reality of a world tearing itself apart. The bridge of words they had so carefully built felt like it had been bombed into rubble. You've seen the world plunge into the nightmare of the First World War, a brutal refutation of the early Esperanto movement's most cherished hope. The war didn't just wound the movement, it left it reeling, its core premise questioned, its network severed. The period that followed the Great War wasn't a return to the optimistic days of pre-1914. Instead, the rise of new, even more virulent forms of nationalism and totalitarianism presented the Esperanto movement with a challenge far more sinister than skepticism or mockery. This wasn't just indifference, it was active, ideological hatred. Imagine surviving the war, perhaps having lost friends or family, having seen the worst of what national division could do. You cling to the idea of Esperanto, the dream of a world beyond such conflict, as a lifeline. But as the 1920s and 30s unfold, you watch with growing horror as regimes come to power that view any form of internationalism, any loyalty or connection that isn't solely to the state, as a direct threat. And your little language, designed explicitly to foster international connection and brotherhood, is suddenly seen as public enemy number one by some of the most dangerous forces the world has ever known. The most notorious examples of this are the Nazi regime in Germany and the Soviet regime under Stalin. Both viewed the Esperanto movement with profound suspicion and hostility, leading to active persecution. This tragic targeting and persecution of Esperantists under totalitarian regimes, particularly the Nazis and Soviets, is a grim but undeniable mainstream historical fact. For these regimes, control was everything. They demanded absolute loyalty to the state, the party, the leader, and often, to a specific national or racial identity. Anything that suggested a shared humanity beyond these boundaries was inherently dangerous. For the Nazis, Esperanto was doubly offensive. Firstly, it was an internationalist movement, promoting connection between Germans and non-Germans, which ran counter to their racist, nationalistic ideology. Secondly, and perhaps even more damningly in their eyes, the creator of Esperanto, Ludwig Zamenhof, was Jewish. The very idea of a Jewish, international language designed to unite peoples was anathema to Nazi racial theory. They saw it not just as a linguistic project, but as a tool of a perceived, international Jewish conspiracy to undermine national identities. Zamenhof's family, many of whom were still in Poland, suffered terribly under the Nazi occupation, with several relatives murdered in the Holocaust. The Nazis actively suppressed Esperanto organizations, confiscated their property, and arrested and often killed leading Esperantists simply for their involvement in the movement. Being an Esperantist became literally a life-threatening identity in Nazi-occupied territories. In the Soviet Union, the initial post-revolution years were somewhat more complex. There was some early interest in Esperanto among certain Bolsheviks who saw its potential as a tool for international communist revolution. For a brief period, Esperanto flourished. But as Stalin consolidated power, and the regime became increasingly paranoid and nationalistic, the view of Esperanto shifted dramatically. International connections not controlled by the state were seen as espionage risks. The internationalist ideals clashed with the socialism in one country doctrine. Esperantists were caught up in the purges of the 1930s, accused of being spies, often for Germany. Ironically, given the Nazi view, Trotskyists, or simply cosmopolitans, a term of abuse used for those seen as lacking loyalty to the Soviet state. Thousands of Soviet Esperantists were arrested, sent to the Gulag, or executed. The movement was effectively crushed within the USSR. Think about the psychological impact of this. You joined a movement based on hope, peace, and linguistic connection, and suddenly, you are deemed an enemy of the state. Your language books are evidence of treason. Your pen pals in other countries are seen as co-conspirators. The simple act of speaking or promoting Esperanto became an act of incredible bravery, a quiet defiance against regimes built on fear and division. It's like being told your hobby of collecting stamps is actually part of a global plot to overthrow the government. The absurdity of the accusation only highlights the depth of the paranoia. A quirky tidbit that underscores this paranoia: some historical accounts suggest that in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, authorities would sometimes present Esperantists with fabricated evidence of their crimes, often involving intercepted or invented Esperanto correspondence twisted to sound like coded messages. Imagine being shown a perfectly innocent letter discussing plans for a future Congress or complaining about grammar difficulties, and having it presented to you as irrefutable proof that you are an international spy plotting against the state. It highlights the Kafkaesque nature of the persecution. Historians still argue whether the persecution of Esperantists under these regimes was primarily due to the specific nature of Esperanto itself, its neutrality, its founder's background, its international structure, or if Esperantists were simply caught up in a broader sweep against any group fostering international connections or expressing ideals that didn't align with totalitarian ideology. Was it the language that was the target, or the people and their inconveniently universalist beliefs? It's a difficult question, as the language and the ideals were so deeply intertwined. This period was undoubtedly the darkest hour for the early Esperanto movement. It faced not just theoretical opposition, but violent, state-sponsored repression. The optimism that had launched the language and built its community was tested to its absolute limit by imprisonment, forced labor, and death. Many dedicated Esperantists perished, their dreams of a united world silenced forever. The bridge of words, already damaged by war, seemed on the verge of being completely dismantled by deliberate, targeted destruction. It was a period of immense loss and suffering, a stark reminder that even the most hopeful and peaceful of movements can become targets when they challenge the foundational principles of powerful, oppressive regimes. But despite the devastation, the story doesn't end here. The flame of optimism, though flickering, was not entirely extinguished. You've journeyed through the bright dawn of hope, seen the sturdy design of the language, witnessed the joy of the first connections and congresses, and then felt the chilling shadow fall, the suspicion, the war, and the targeted, brutal persecution under totalitarian regimes. That was the darkest hour, a time when the very existence of the Esperanto movement seemed precarious, its members imprisoned, its books burned, its ideals deemed criminal. It would be easy to assume that such an assault, from forces as powerful and ruthless as the Nazis and Soviets, would simply extinguish the flame entirely, leaving nothing but ashes and a forgotten dream. But here's the truly surprising part: it survived. Against all logical odds, against the full might of states determined to crush it, the Esperanto movement persisted. How? Not through military strength or political maneuvering, but through the quiet, determined resilience of individuals. Remember that it wasn't a state-backed entity. It wasn't tied to a specific territory or army. It existed in people's minds, in their hearts, and in their scattered books and letters. And while regimes could imprison people and burn books, they couldn't entirely erase an idea, especially one that had taken root in so many diverse places. The survival wasn't a grand, organized resistance. It was a million small acts of stubborn hope. Imagine the scene in secret. Perhaps a few friends meeting in a basement, sharing a single, carefully hidden copy of Un Libro, whispering the grammar rules to each other. Or someone burying their Esperanto dictionary in the garden, hoping to unearth it when better times came. Letters, written in code or smuggled across borders, keeping faint lines of connection alive. People teaching their children the language at home, passing the torch of the dream to the next generation away from the prying eyes of the authorities. These weren't acts of overt rebellion in the traditional sense. They were acts of cultural and ideological preservation, a quiet refusal to let the darkness extinguish the light of international understanding. It's like trying to stomp out every single dandelion in a field by hand. Eventually, some are going to survive and bloom again. Even in the most oppressive environments, kernels of the community survived. In the Soviet Union, after the worst of the purges, small, unofficial groups cautiously re-emerged, communicating under the radar. In Nazi-occupied Europe, while public activity was impossible and many perished, some individuals maintained clandestine contact or kept their knowledge of the language alive in secret, a personal act of defiance. The mainstream historical fact here is that despite the immense losses and suppression during the world wars and under totalitarian regimes, the Esperanto movement was able to regroup and rebuild relatively quickly in many parts of the world after World War II. The first post-war World Congress of Esperanto was held in 1947 in Bern, Switzerland, just 2 years after the fighting stopped, bringing together people from countries that had recently been mortal enemies. That Congress, and subsequent ones, were powerful symbols of the movement's enduring spirit, and its refusal to be destroyed by conflict and hatred. It was a testament to the fact that the connections forged through Esperanto ran deeper than nationalistic animosity for many. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the lengths people went to preserve the language. There are accounts of Esperantists who, when facing imprisonment or deportation, would try to quickly scribble down key vocabulary or grammar rules on scraps of paper or even on fabric hidden in their clothing, hoping to hold on to the language that represented their connection to a better world. Imagine risking your life just to remember how to say peace or friend in a language that was illegal. It highlights the profound meaning the language held for these individuals. Historians still argue whether the survival of Esperanto was primarily due to its decentralized nature, making it hard to decapitate the movement entirely, the deep personal commitment of its core adherents who saw it as more than just a language but a moral cause, or simply the fact that it was never large or politically powerful enough to be seen as a total threat by all regimes, allowing it to survive in pockets even when suppressed elsewhere. Was it too small to kill, or too meaningful to die? The core optimism, though severely tested and perhaps tempered by the horrors witnessed, never fully died. For those who survived, the dream of a world united by language wasn't proven wrong by the war and the persecution. It was proven more necessary than ever. The suffering they endured only reinforced their belief that the divisions Esperanto sought to bridge were real and deadly, and the fight for understanding and peace, however difficult, was essential. The language became not just a tool, but a symbol of resistance against the forces of division and hatred. Speaking Esperanto after the war wasn't just about communication. It was an affirmation of human connection, a quiet memorial to those lost, and a renewed pledge to the hopeful future Zamenhof had envisioned. They rebuilt their organizations, restarted their journals, and began the slow, painstaking process of finding each other again across a scarred and divided world. The names of those who perished became martyrs for the cause, their sacrifices a reminder of the high stakes involved in pursuing internationalism. The movement that emerged from the ashes was perhaps less naive than its pre-war predecessor, having stared into the abyss of human cruelty. But its fundamental belief in the potential for understanding through a shared, neutral language remained its driving force. The flame of optimism, though it had burned low, was still alight, ready to illuminate the path forward in a world desperate for connection after so much darkness. They had faced the worst and survived, and that survival itself was a powerful, albeit hard one, testament to the enduring spirit of hope. You've witnessed the incredible journey, from a young boy's radical dream born in the linguistic melting pot of Białystok, through the painstaking creation of a logical, neutral language, the hopeful launch of Unwinding, the vibrant connections forged through letters and early congresses, the establishment of a stable foundation, and then the crushing weight of skepticism, war, and brutal persecution. You've seen the darkest hours, when the very idea of international brotherhood through language seemed not just naive, but mortally dangerous. It would be understandable, after all that, to think the story ends with a sigh, a quiet acknowledgement that some dreams, however beautiful, are just too fragile for the harsh realities of the world. But the surprising thing, the truly enduring legacy of that early Esperanto movement, is that its core optimism, though battered and bruised, did not die. It survived, and it continues to resonate today. Think about it. A language deliberately designed for peace and understanding, created by a man who signed himself Dr. Hope, built on a foundation of radical accessibility and neutrality. That spirit, that fundamental belief that humanity can overcome its divisions if given the right tools, is still embedded in the heart of the Esperanto community. The early pioneers didn't just build a language, they built a culture of hope. They proved through their own efforts that people from vastly different backgrounds could connect as equals, simply by choosing to meet on neutral linguistic ground. That proof of concept, demonstrated at that first Congress in Boulogne-sur-Mer and maintained through decades of adversity, is a powerful legacy. It stands as a living counterargument to the cynicism that says division is inevitable, that people will always find reasons to hate and fight. The mainstream historical fact that highlights this enduring spirit is the continued existence and activity of the global Esperanto community right up to the present day. Despite the immense challenges, the lack of state support, the competition from dominant national languages, the persecution it faced, the movement never disappeared. There are still active national and international Esperanto organizations, publications, radio broadcasts, cultural events, and perhaps most significantly, annual World Congresses that continue to bring together thousands of speakers from around the globe, still conducted primarily in Esperanto. The fact that over a century after its creation, people are still learning and using this language specifically for international communication and cultural exchange is a direct continuation of that early optimistic vision. It's like finding out that little bridge of words, bombed and shelled, was secretly rebuilt plank by determined volunteers, and people are still walking across it today. The legacy isn't just about the language itself, but about the idea it represents. Esperanto remains a symbol of internationalism, linguistic rights, the idea that no one should be at a disadvantage in international communication based on their mother tongue, and the possibility of a more equitable and peaceful world. For many who learn it today, it's not just a practical skill, it's an act of solidarity, a conscious choice to participate in a community that actively embodies principles of equality and mutual understanding. It's joining a global family explicitly founded on the principle of getting along. Can you imagine joining a community whose stated goal is literally, let's be friends? It's delightfully earnest, isn't it? A quirky tidbit that shows this continuity, the tradition of the Passport service, a network where Esperanto speakers offer free accommodation to other Esperantists traveling abroad, continues to this day. This grassroots hospitality network, built purely on trust and shared language, is a direct descendant of those early pen-pal networks and the spirit of mutual aid that characterized the pioneers. It's a tangible manifestation of the belief that a shared language creates a bond strong enough for you to literally invite a stranger from across the world into your home. Try doing that with Google Translate and a phrasebook. Historians still argue whether the early Esperanto movement's focus on language as the primary solution to world conflict was a fundamental misdiagnosis of the problem, or if it was a strategically smart way to approach complex socio-political issues by focusing on a tangible, solvable part of the equation. Was Zamenhof's initial premise too simplistic, or was it a necessary simplification to create a practical tool for change? Regardless, the idealism behind that premise, the belief that a better world was not just desirable but achievable, is what continues to draw people to Esperanto today. The early Esperantists faced immense pressure to abandon their dream, to accept the world as inevitably divided and hostile. But they held on. They rebuilt. They kept speaking, kept writing, kept meeting. Their survival wasn't just about the language's structure. It was about the unwavering faith of its adherents in the power of connection and the potential for human goodness. That profound, almost radical, optimism, born in the face of 19th-century conflict and tested by 20th-century horrors, is the true legacy. It's a quiet, persistent hope that whispers across borders, reminding us that while linguistic difference can be a barrier, a shared, neutral language can still be a bridge, a tool for understanding, and a symbol of a world where, perhaps, one day, everyone can truly speak to each other as equals. It's a story of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of a simple, elegant idea to connect people across time and space. And so, as you drift now, away from those cobbled streets and flickering lamps, away from the whispered lessons and the hopeful congresses, remember the surprising optimism that started it all. Remember the dream of a world united, not by force or by the dominance of one culture, but by the simple, shared act of speaking a common, neutral tongue. It's a dream that faced ridicule and ruin, yet somehow, it endured. And in its enduring, it reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming difficulty, hope, like a well-designed language, can find a way to survive, to connect, and to keep the conversation going. Allow the images to soften now, the sounds to fade. The story of Dr. Esperanto and his hopeful language settles into the quiet corners of your mind. The tensions of the past, the struggles and the triumphs, recede into the distance, leaving just the gentle hum of a world still yearning for connection, a world where the simple act of understanding feels like a quiet miracle. And maybe, just maybe, the bridge of words is still being built, one hopeful conversation at a time. Rest now. The journey is complete.